Prologue. The young man. I am a young man of 23. That was how he began. He sat for a long time staring at the words. The paper lay in front of him on the table, completely white and almost threatening. A writing pad from the supermarket, bought without any special thought. And yet it felt as if his entire future rested on that very sheet of paper. He read the sentence again. I am a young man of 23. It sounded stupid. Everything sounded stupid. He picked up the pen again, but his hand trembled slightly. He wiped it against his trouser leg. Why was it so difficult? The advertisement had seemed so simple. A young, stable man with his heart in the right place wanted. He had read it several times in the newspaper, at first just out of curiosity, then again the next day, and again. Eventually, he began to imagine her, what she might look like, how she might speak, whether she had dark hair, whether she liked music. He had almost been able to see her, but now he sat here, with a piece of paper, and not a single word felt right. Would she simply throw the letter away? He looked down at the paper. His letter. Suddenly, he tore the page from the pad, crumpled it up, and threw it into the wastebasket. It was probably useless anyway. A heavy feeling spread through his chest. The familiar loneliness. The one that crept in during the evenings when the silence became too great. He leaned back in the chair, and then he began to think about her. Not the woman from the advertisement. Chapter 1. The disco. It all began at a disco. He could still remember that evening clearly. The music, the lights, and the feeling of being young. He had just received his first paycheck. A real paycheck. Not pocket money or a holiday job, but money he had earned himself. It had to be celebrated. The disco was at the other end of town. A dark room with colored lamps in the ceiling and a bar along one wall. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and perfume. That was how places were back then. The music pumped out of the speakers. A new song by the Bee Gees. He stood for a while watching the dance floor. Girls in colorful dresses and boys in freshly pressed shirts. Everyone seemed to know exactly what they were doing. He did not. He walked up to the bar. The bartender was a man with a mustache and quick hands. "One beer," he said. The bottle was opened with a quick snap. He took a sip and felt the cold liquid slide down his throat. It helped. He lit a cigarette. Then it happened. He did not quite know how. Suddenly, he was standing on the dance floor, and in front of him stood her. She was about his age, maybe a year younger. She had light hair and a smile that made it difficult to think clearly. They began to dance, at first a little carefully, then more freely. The music filled the room. The Bee Gees were singing about love and summer. He thought that this must be what happiness felt like. Chapter 2. The visit. A few weeks passed. He did not think much about the evening at the disco anymore. Not until the telephone rang at work. "It's me," said the voice. He recognized it immediately. She asked if she could come by one day. "I'll bring a friend," she said. He said yes. Of course he said yes. That whole day he hardly worked at all. He went home earlier and began to tidy up his apartment. He vacuumed the floor, wiped the table, moved the furniture around a little. It was not as if the apartment suddenly became beautiful, but it was at least a little less messy. When the doorbell rang, he jumped slightly. He knew it would happen. Still, his heart started beating faster. He opened the door. There they stood, the girl from the disco, and her friend. They came inside. They sat down in the chairs while he went into the kitchen to make coffee. The conversation started immediately, but gradually he realized that something was different. The girl from the disco was not quite as he remembered her. She seemed less exciting, less alive. But the friend, he looked at her, and in that moment something happened inside him. She was 18 years old. She had dark hair and a calm gaze. She did not say much, but when she smiled it felt as if the whole room became a little brighter. His heart began to beat faster, and without knowing it yet, his life was about to change direction. Chapter 3. The phone call. It took him several days to gather the courage. The phone number lay written on a small piece of paper on the table next to the telephone. He had written it down when she mentioned where she worked, a clothing shop in the city. "You can always call," she had said. "Maybe you can get a few % off." She had said it with a smile, and he had nodded as if it were just a practical arrangement. But that was not why he wanted a call. The paper lay there for several days. Every time he walked past the table, he looked at it. Sometimes he picked it up, read the number, and put it down again. One afternoon, he finally sat down by the telephone. "She won't want to go out with you anyway," he muttered quietly to himself. "You big fool." He picked up the receiver, dialed the first number. The line crackled softly, then the next. At last the phone began ringing at the other end. An older man answered. "Good afternoon. This is the men's clothing department." His courage almost disappeared again. I would like to speak with," he said, mentioning her name. There was silence for a moment. "She's very busy right now," the man said dryly. He was just about to hang up. But then something happened at the other end. Voices. A bit of movement. Suddenly it was her. "Hello." He felt his pulse rise immediately. It's me," he said. A small laugh came from her. "I know who it is." They talked back and forth for a while. Nothing special, just small things. But then she said, "We could meet one day." He held his breath. "That would be nice." "On Tuesday," she said, "outside Tivoli." Afterward he hung up the receiver and remained sitting there for a long time. He felt as if he'd just done something very brave. Chapter 4. Tivoli. He arrived far too early. Half an hour before the agreed time, he was already standing in front of the entrance to Tivoli Gardens. It was a mild summer evening. The air was warm, and the city buzzed with people. Tourists, families, young couples walking hand in hand. He paced a little back and forth on the sidewalk, trying to look relaxed. But in reality, he watched every single face that came walking down the street. She arrived 15 minutes late, but she came. He saw her already from a distance. She walked quickly through the crowd, as if she were a little out of breath. And then he noticed the dress. It was yellow, with black dots. It hung lightly around her body and moved as she walked. He had never seen anything so beautiful. She stopped in front of him. "Hi," she said. "Hi." They stood for a moment without saying anything. Then they began to walk. Inside Tivoli Gardens there were lights everywhere. Small lamps hung between the trees, and the music from the orchestra floated across the lawns. They walked along the small paths, talking about little things. Work, the weather, music. But to him, it felt as if the whole world had changed. Sparkles. Chapter 5. The yellow dress. He could not help looking at her, not in an intrusive way, just in small glances. When she turned her head, when she laughed, the yellow dress did something to him. It was simple, almost childish with its black dots, but it suited her. They sat down on a bench somewhere between the trees. It was a little darker there. The music from the orchestra in Tivoli Gardens reached them faintly. She sat with her hands in her lap, looking out over the garden. "I like Tivoli," she said. I do too. He said it almost in a whisper. There was something about the moment that made him careful, as if a loud voice could ruin it. He wanted to say something important, something real, but the words did not come. So they just sat there, and for the first time in a long time, he did not feel alone. Chapter 6. Falling in Love. It began quietly. At first he only thought about her a little, then a little more. Gradually she began to appear in his thoughts all the time. At work, when he cycled home, when he lay down in bed at night, he began to imagine the future. What would it be like if they were together? If she sat in his apartment reading? If they went for walks on Sundays? If one day she held his hand and never let go again? He never said any of this to her. He did not dare. Instead, they continued to meet from time to time. They went for walks. They drank coffee. Sometimes they danced. Other times she did not show up for their appointments. Those times hurt the most. He might be standing outside a cinema or by a cafe waiting, and after an hour he would go home again. Still, he called the next time. Still, he hoped. He had fallen in love, and it had no intention of letting him go. Chapter 7. The Waiting. The waiting slowly became a part of his life. It began innocently enough. They had arranged to meet one Friday afternoon outside the cinema. He arrived a little early, as he always did. He stood looking at the posters in the glass display cases, pretending to be interested in the films. But in reality, he was watching the door. People came and went. Couples, families, young people laughing and pushing each other playfully. She did not come. After 15 minutes, he began to look at his watch. After half an hour, he began walking back and forth a little. After an hour, he went home. He tried to convince himself that there was surely a good explanation. Maybe she had been delayed. Maybe she had forgotten. Maybe she just had not felt like coming. Still, he called again a few days later. And when they finally did meet, she was kind and smiling, as if there had never been any appointment that had been forgotten. That made it difficult for him to be angry. So he wasn't. The waiting continued. Chapter 8. The Postcard. Summer arrived. He was going on vacation for 2 weeks. Not a big trip, just a few days away from work in the city. Before he left, he asked for her address. "Then I can send you a postcard," he said. She wrote the address on a small piece of paper and handed it to him. He put it in his wallet, as if it were something valuable. During the vacation, he found a shop that sold postcards. There were many to choose from. Small cards with pictures of beaches, boats, and sunsets. But he chose the largest one. A big card with a picture of the sea and a blue sky without clouds. He sat down at a small table and began to write. It took a long time. The words once again felt difficult. In the end, he simply wrote, "I hope you're well. I'm thinking about you. See you when I get home." He mailed the card. The rest of the vacation passed slowly. He went for walks, sat in cafes, watched people, but almost the entire time he was thinking about her. It became the longest vacation he had ever had. Chapter 9. Work begins to go wrong. Gradually, his infatuation began to creep into everything, even his work. He worked with machines, work that required concentration and precision. But his thoughts were rarely where they were supposed to be. Often he stood staring into the air without really noticing what he was doing. "You're not quite present today," one of the co-workers said one morning. He just shrugged. Another time he made a mistake in his work. One of the older men in the workshop scolded him. "You need to keep your head on the job," he said. It should have been a simple thing. But his thoughts kept wandering. To her smile, to the yellow dress, to the meetings that might come. Some days he could hardly remember what he had done. His reputation at the workplace slowly began to change. Before, he had been a quiet, reliable young man. Now, some of the others began to shake their heads at him. Chapter 10. Dreams of Fame. When he came home in the evenings, the dreams began. He sat alone in his apartment, often with the radio on. Music filled the room. New songs from England and America. Voices singing about love, longing, and freedom. Sometimes he closed his eyes. Then the imagination began. He imagined himself standing on a stage. The lights were shining on him. An orchestra played behind him. People stood close in front of the stage, listening. And somewhere in the audience stood her. She looked up at him with the gaze he had missed for so long. Now she saw him, truly saw him. He was no longer just a man among many. He was someone, a musician, an artist, someone special. But when the song on the radio ended, the dream disappeared again. He sat alone in the quiet apartment. The next morning work was waiting, and reality. But the dream kept returning, because if he could not have her in real life, he could at least imagine a world where she might one day see him in a completely different way. Chapter 11. The New Year's Party. He was invited to New Year's at her family's house. It came a little unexpectedly. She mentioned it almost in passing one afternoon as they walked through the city. "You could come along," she said. It was probably said without much thought, but to him it meant something entirely different. All through December he walked around in a strange state, as if he were floating slightly above the ground. He bought a new suit for the occasion, a dark one that felt a little stiff at first, but which he quickly got used to. Several times he stood in front of the mirror at home, adjusting the jacket. It was not because he usually cared much about clothes, but this time was different. New Year's Eve arrived. Her family lived in a house a little outside the city. When he arrived, he could already hear laughter and music coming from the living room. He knocked. The door was opened by her father. "Good evening," the man said kindly. He stepped inside and was quickly introduced to one person after another. Aunts, uncles, cousins. There were many people. To his own surprise, he quickly blended into the gathering. People were friendly, and the conversation flowed easily. They ate, drank, and danced. Now and then he caught sight of her at the other end of the room. She was talking with someone or laughing at a story. Each time he saw her, he felt hope growing. At one point, he pulled her a little aside. "You once said you would find out whether we should start seeing each other," he said carefully. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. "Yes, let's try." He felt warmth spread through his body. The new year began with hope. Chapter 12. The 4 days. It lasted only 4 days. 4 strange days. He had imagined something entirely different. In his mind, it should have been the beginning of something big, something light and joyful. But reality felt different. When they were together, she suddenly seemed quieter, more distant, as if she did not quite know what to do with the situation. He tried to act naturally, but inside him a restlessness grew. He could feel that something was not right. One afternoon they walked through the city without really talking. That was when he realized she had said yes, but her heart was not in it. That realization struck him harder than he had thought possible. For days later, it quietly faded away again. No arguments, no drama, just a quiet understanding. Chapter 13. The New Guy. Some time passed before he saw her again. One day, he decided to stop by her workplace, just to say hello. She stood behind the counter when he came in. For a moment, she almost looked happy to see him. They talked for a little while. Then suddenly she grew quiet. "I'd better say it," she said softly. He almost already knew what was coming. "I've met someone." The words hung in the air between them for a moment. He nodded slowly. "Well, it was probably about time," he said. She looked a little surprised at how calmly he took it, but inside it felt as if something sank. Not dramatically, just heavily, like a stone slowly sinking to the bottom of the water. When he stepped out into the street again, the city suddenly seemed a little different, a little more unfamiliar. Chapter 14. The years that pass. The years passed. Not with great events, just quietly. Work continued. Everyday life found its rhythm. He met other people, made friends, experienced small joys and small disappointments like everyone else. But now and then she appeared in his thoughts, often without any particular reason. When he heard a certain song, when he walked past Tivoli, or when he saw a yellow dress in a shop window. He had tried many times to forget her, but some people never completely disappear. They remain somewhere in the heart, no longer as pain, just as a quiet memory, like a chapter in life, a chapter that was never fully finished. Chapter 15. The old typewriter. Many years had passed, so many that he had begun to refer to them simply as back then, back when he was young, back when everything still seemed possible. Now the apartment was quiet, the same apartment, yet not quite the same. The furniture had been replaced over the years, and the walls had been painted new colors, but the silence remained the same. He sat at the table. In front of him stood the old typewriter. It had been in a closet for many years. He had almost forgotten he still had it until one day he found it again while cleaning up. It was heavy, as old things often are. The metal had grown slightly dull, and some of the letters on the keys were worn. He inserted a sheet of paper into the machine. It had been a long time since he last did that. The sound of the roller turning the paper into place awakened a strange feeling in him, a mixture of nostalgia and something else he could not quite put into words. He sat for a moment without writing. Outside the window, people walked past, young people talking and laughing on their way somewhere. He watched them for a moment. Then he turned back to the paper. He thought about the many years that had passed, about the people he had met, about the paths life had taken. And then, almost without meaning to, she appeared in his thoughts again, not as before, not with the same pain or longing, just as a memory, like one of the stories we carry with us through life. He leaned back slightly in the chair and let his hands rest on the table. His fingers had grown older now, wrinkled, slower, but they could still write. Chapter 16. The letter. He took a deep breath. Then he placed his fingers on the keys. For a moment he hesitated. It was strange how difficult it could still be to begin. But then he started to write, slowly, letter by letter. I am an older man of 67. He paused for a moment and read the sentence again. There was something about it that made him smile faintly, perhaps because it reminded him of something far back in time. Another table, another sheet of paper, a younger man. He continued, I do not quite know how to begin a letter like this, but I thought I would try anyway. He leaned back again. Outside, evening had begun to fall. The street lights came on one by one. He looked at the paper. Maybe the letter would be sent. Maybe not. It was not so important anymore. What mattered was that he could still begin. That life, in a strange way, always gives you another chance. He placed his hands in his lap and looked out through the window. Young people walked past on the sidewalk. A girl in a light dress laughed at something a boy had said. For a moment, He almost thought he could hear the music from an old disco. The Bee Gees, the yellow dress, Tivoli on a summer evening. He smiled to himself. Then he turned back to the typewriter and began the next line. Thanks for listening to my story. A story about love, memory, and the words we never found the courage to say. This short story follows the life of a young man whose quiet love begins on a summer evening at a disco. What starts with music, dancing, and a simple meeting slowly turns into something deeper, a love that never quite finds its way into the right words. Through moments at Tivoli Gardens, long periods of waiting, and years that quietly pass, the story explores how certain people remain with us long after they are gone. Sometimes love is not about what happened, but about what might have been. Many years later, the man sits down at an old typewriter and begins to write a letter that perhaps should have been written long ago. A gentle and reflective story about youth, longing, missed chances, and the memories that stay with us throughout life. If you enjoy quiet, nostalgic stories about love and life, this story is for you. If you like this story, please like and subscribe to my canal for more videos. Thanks again.